January 21st, 1793, the execution of Louis XVI that led to 40,000 deaths, French Revolution. The morning of January 21st, 1793, did not begin with the golden light of a royal awakening. There were no servants to draw back heavy velvet curtains, no courtiers waiting in the Hall of Mirrors to catch a glimpse of the Sun King's descendant, and no whispers of statecraft over silver platters of fruit. Instead, there was only the suffocating, damp chill of a stone cell in the Temple prison. The man who had once been Louis XVI, by the grace of God, King of France and Navarre, sat in the shadows, listening to the rhythmic, distant sound of drums echoing through the fog-choked streets of Paris. He was no longer a king. In the eyes of the men who now held the keys to his life, he was simply citizen Louis Capet, a man whose existence had become a logical impossibility for the new world they were trying to build. To understand how the most powerful monarch in Europe ended up shivering in a prison cell, waiting for a cart to carry him to a wooden scaffold, one must look past the blood and the anger of the revolution. One must look at the tragedy of a man who believed that the law could protect him from the wind of history. Louis had always been a man of quiet dignity, perhaps too quiet for the era of thunder in which he lived. He was a locksmith by hobby, a man who loved the precision of gears and the predictable click of a bolt sliding into place. He treated the French Constitution of 1791 much like one of his locks, a mechanism he believed would hold, a contract he thought both he and his people would honor. But he failed to realize that when a nation is starving, when the very air of Paris smells of gunpowder and desperation, a constitution is nothing more than a scrap of paper, and a king is nothing more than a target. The descent from the heights of Versailles to the mud of the Place de la Révolution was not a sudden fall. It was a slow, agonizing erosion. For years, the French people had looked toward the palace as the source of their misery. While the Queen, Marie Antoinette, was painted as a symbol of foreign decadence, Louis was seen as a weak father, a man who could neither feed his children nor lead them. When the Bastille fell in 1789, he had written nothing in his diary, referring to his day's hunt. That word would haunt his legacy, a symbol of a man who was looking at the birds while the earth beneath his feet was opening into a canyon. By 1792, the monarchy had been abolished, and the king was a prisoner. He spent his days in the Temple, reading to his son and trying to maintain a semblance of royal composure, even as the guards blew tobacco smoke in his face and scrawled insults on the walls of his quarters. He clung to the hope that a trial would be his salvation. He believed that if he could only explain his intentions, if he could show that he had always acted for the good of France, the people would remember their old love for him. He did not realize that he was not being summoned to a courtroom, but to a theater of shadows, where the ending had already been written in ink and blood. The National Convention, the body that would judge him, was a sea of black coats and burning eyes. Among them sat the radicals, the Jacobins, led by the cold, incorruptible Maximilien Robespierre. For Robespierre and his protégé, the young and terrifying Saint-Just, the trial of the king was a paradox. They argued that if the king were to be tried, it implied he could be found innocent, and if the king were innocent, then the revolution itself was a crime. Therefore, they concluded with a chilling, mechanical logic that Louis must die, not because he was guilty of a specific deed, but because he was a king and a republic cannot be born while a monarch still breathes. Louis must die so that the country may live, Robespierre declared to the assembly. It was a sentence of death disguised as a philosophical necessity, yet the radicals needed a spark, a piece of evidence that would silence the more moderate members of the convention who still hesitated to kill a man who had once been sacred. That spark was found behind a hidden panel in the Tuileries Palace. It was a secret iron chest, the armoire de fer, crafted by the king's own locksmith, Gamin. But the man who had taught the king his craft betrayed him, revealing the location of the chest to the revolutionary authorities. Inside, they found the smoking gun they had been hunting for, hundreds of documents, letters, and secret correspondences with foreign powers and counter-revolutionary agents. The papers painted a picture of a king who, while publicly accepting the revolution, was privately plotting to crush it with the help of Austrian and Prussian bayonets. To the people of Paris, this was the ultimate betrayal. The father of the people was revealed to be a conspirator against his own children. When Louis was finally brought before the convention to answer the charges, he stood with a calm that unnerved his accusers. He was dressed simply, his hair unpowdered, his face pale but steady. He denied the existence of the secret chest. He denied the validity of the documents. He leaned on the Constitution of 1791, which stated that the person of the king was inviolable. He spoke as a man who still believed in the old rules of the game. But the game had changed. The men judging him were no longer his subjects. They were his executioners. The chamber was packed with spectators who hissed and cheered like a crowd at a macabre circus. Every time Louis spoke, he was met with the cold stare of the galleries, where the sans-culottes, the radical working class, demanded his head as payment for their years of hunger and humiliation. The trial dragged on through the dark, cold days of December 1792. Louis's defense team, led by the courageous Malesherbes, argued brilliantly that the king could not be tried for actions he took while he was legally the head of state. Malesherbes knew he was signing his own death warrant by defending the king, but he did it out of a sense of duty to a man he saw as fundamentally decent, if tragically misplaced in time. But logic and law were no match for the political gravity of the moment. The Jacobins used the fear of foreign invasion and the threat of internal riots to pressure the more hesitant deputies. They turned the vote into a test of revolutionary purity. To vote for the king's life was to be a traitor to the Republic. As the new year of 1793 dawned, the tension in Paris reached a breaking point. The city was a powder keg. Bread was scarce, the weather was brutal, and the rumor of a royalist plot to spring the king from prison sent waves of paranoia through the streets. Inside the convention, the roll call began. Each deputy had to stand and announce his vote in front of the entire assembly. It was a slow, agonizing process that lasted for 72 hours. Some deputies spoke with passion, others with a trembling voice, and some, like the king's own cousin, Philippe Égalité, shocked the room by voting for death. When the final count was tallied, the margin was razor-thin, but the result was absolute. Louis Capet was sentenced to death. When the news was brought to him in the Temple prison, Louis was found reading a book of history. He received the sentence with a stoicism that seemed almost inhuman. He did not cry. He did not beg. He only asked for 3 days to prepare himself and to say goodbye to his family. The convention granted him only 24 hours. That final night in the Temple was a scene of domestic heartbreak that would be etched into the memory of French history. He met with his wife, Marie Antoinette, and their children in a small, dimly lit room. For 2 hours the family clung to one another, their sobs muffled by the thick stone walls. Louis made his young son, the Dauphin, swear that he would never seek vengeance for his father's death. He spoke to his wife in hushed tones, perhaps apologizing for the crown he had placed on her head, a crown that had become a circle of thorns. When he finally tore himself away, he promised to see them again the next morning, but it was a lie of mercy. He knew he could not endure another goodbye. As the night deepened, the city of Paris fell into an unnatural silence. The government had ordered all shops closed and all citizens to remain indoors. General Santerre had mobilized 80,000 armed men to line the route from the prison to the execution site. The authorities were terrified of a last-minute rescue attempt, but they were also afraid of the silence. They were afraid that if the people saw the king, they might remember his humanity and turn against the Republic. To prevent this, they prepared a wall of drums. Thousands of drummers were stationed along the path, ordered to play continuously, so that no voice, no cry for mercy, and no final royal command could be heard by the masses. Inside his cell, Louis slept a deep, dreamless sleep, a final act of defiance against the chaos outside. He was woken at 5 in the morning by Cléry, his faithful valet. He dressed with care, wearing a simple brown coat and a white waistcoat. He refused to wear his hat, as if he wanted the world to see his face one last time. He heard the sound of the carriage wheels on the cobblestones outside, the sound of the tumbril, the machine of the revolution, coming to collect its most prestigious debt. As he stepped out of the prison and into the thick grey fog of that January morning, Louis Capet did not look like a traitor. He looked like a man who had finally found the peace that the throne had always denied him. He stepped into the carriage. accompanied by an Irish priest, Father Edgeworth, and began the long, slow journey toward the Place de la Révolution. The streets were lined with soldiers, their bayonets gleaming in the dull light. But the people were invisible, hidden behind shuttered windows, watching the ghost of their old world pass by in a wooden box. He did not know it yet, but the blade waiting for him was not the end of the violence. It was the key that would unlock a floodgate of blood, a mechanical hunger that would soon demand 40,000 more lives, starting with the very men who had just signed his death warrant. The carriage wheels groaned against the frozen mud of the Paris streets, a rhythmic, haunting clatter that marked the final minutes of a 1,000-year-old dynasty. Inside the green carriage, the air was thick with the scent of old leather and the whispered Latin of the prayers for the dying. Louis sat opposite Father Edgeworth, his eyes fixed on the pages of a breviary, his fingers steady despite the chaos that waited beyond the glass. Outside, the world had turned into a fortress of steel and silence. The fog was so dense that it seemed as if the city itself were trying to hide from what was about to happen, wrapping the boulevards in a grey, suffocating shroud. But the fog could not dampen the sound. The drums, thousands of them, beat a continuous rolling tattoo that vibrated through the floorboards of the carriage and into the very bones of the man who had once been the Sun King's heir. It was a wall of sound designed to drown out any cry for mercy, any shout of "Long live the King," and any final words that might stir the dormant loyalty of the French soul. As the procession moved toward the Place de la Révolution, the obstacles were not just the 80,000 armed men lining the route, but the sheer, crushing weight of the inevitable. Every window was shuttered, every door was bolted. The revolutionary government had turned Paris into a tomb while the king was still breathing. Louis looked out through the fog and saw the silhouettes of the National Guard, their bayonets fixed, their faces obscured by the mist. He was a man who had always lived in a world of protocol and ceremony, where every movement was dictated by tradition. Now the ceremony was a funeral march, and the protocol was being dictated by the men who hated him. He felt the carriage lurch and sway, and for a moment he was transported back to the hunting forests of Compiègne, back to the days when the only thing he had to fear was a missed shot or a sudden storm. But the storm had finally broken, and it was made of iron and ideology. Deep within the silence of his own mind, Louis wrestled with the ghost of his own legacy. He had tried to be a good king. He had truly believed that by accepting the Constitution, by trying to navigate the impossible demands of the radicals and the royals, he was saving France from itself. But in the cold light of this January morning, he realized his mistake. He had treated a wildfire like a candle that could be snuffed out with a gentle breath. He had been too human for a role that demanded a god, and too indecisive for a time that demanded a tyrant. He thought of his wife, Marie Antoinette, still trapped in the temple, and his children, who would now inherit nothing but a name that had become a curse. The pain of that realization was sharper than any blade. He felt the urge to scream, to demand that the carriage stop, to assert the divine right that had been whispered into his ear since the day he was born. But he suppressed it. If he could not live as a king, he would at least die as a Christian. Suddenly the carriage came to a jarring halt near the Porte Saint-Denis. A ripple of movement disturbed the wall of soldiers. A voice pierced through the rhythmic thud of the drums, a desperate, lonely cry. "To me, my friends, to me those who would save the king." It was the Baron de Batz, a loyalist who had spent weeks plotting a daring rescue. He and a handful of companions tried to break through the ranks of the National Guard, hoping to spark a mass uprising, hoping that the sight of their king would turn the soldiers' hearts. But the response was a chilling, absolute silence. The people did not move. The soldiers did not waver. The few loyalists were quickly dispersed, swallowed by the sea of blue uniforms. Louis heard the scuffle, saw the flash of a sword through the mist, and then felt the carriage move forward again. The last hope of a miracle had evaporated into the fog. The world was not coming to save him. It was waiting for him to disappear. The carriage reached the edge of the great square, formerly the Place Louis XV, named after the king's grandfather. It was a place where Louis had once been celebrated, where the statues of his ancestors had stood as symbols of eternal power. Now, the statue of Louis XV had been torn down, leaving only an empty, scarred pedestal. In its place stood a new monument, a tall wooden structure painted a dull, bloody red. The guillotine. It rose from the center of the square like a skeletal finger pointing toward the grey sky. As the carriage door opened, the sound of the drums reached a deafening crescendo. The smell of the square was a mixture of wet horsehair, wood smoke, and the metallic tang of the damp morning air. Louis stepped out, and for the first time, he felt the true cold of the winter. He refused the help of the guards, stepping onto the muddy ground with a dignity that seemed to push back against the jeers of the few spectators who had managed to get close. Standing before him was Charles-Henri Sanson, the High Executioner of Paris. Sanson was a man who lived in the shadow of death, a professional who had inherited his grim trade from his father and his grandfather. He looked at Louis not with hatred, but with a strange, professional sadness. He knew that the man standing before him was the ultimate prize of the revolution, but he also knew the mechanics of the task. He stepped forward to perform the first of the final indignities. He reached for Louis's silk coat, but the king stepped back, his eyes flashing with a sudden royal fire. "I will undress myself," he said, his voice surprisingly firm over the rolling drums. He removed his coat and his necktie, laying them aside as if he were simply preparing for bed. But then Sanson produced a length of rope. "I must bind your hands, monsieur," the executioner said. The king recoiled. To have his hands bound like a common thief was a bridge too far. This was the final desecration of his person, the ultimate stripping of his sovereignty. "Never!" Louis cried, his voice breaking with indignation. "I will never submit to this." He looked toward the guards, his hand moving to his side as if searching for a sword that was no longer there. The tension in the square became a physical thing, a cord stretched to the point of snapping. The soldiers shifted their weight, their muskets ready. For a heartbeat, it seemed as if the execution would turn into a brawl, a messy, undignified struggle in the mud. Father Edgeworth leaned in, whispering into the king's ear, reminding him of the ultimate sacrifice of Christ, who had also allowed his hands to be bound. Louis's shoulders slumped. The fire went out of his eyes, replaced by a weary, holy resignation. "Do what you will," he murmured. "I will drink the cup to the dregs." He offered his wrists to Sanson. The rough hemp rope bit into his skin, a jarring contrast to the lace and silk he had worn his entire life. Then came the final preparation, the cutting of his hair. Sanson took a pair of shears and clumsily lopped off the long, powdered curls that fell over the king's collar. This was the grande toilette in reverse, a mockery of the elaborate morning rituals of Versailles. Instead of being prepared for the eyes of the court, he was being prepared for the neck rest of the machine. The hair fell into the mud, grey and lifeless, trampled by the boots of the guards. Louis began to climb the steep wooden stairs of the scaffold. Each step was a struggle, the wood slick with the morning's frost. He reached the top and looked out over the vast expanse of the square. Beyond the lines of soldiers, he could see the thousands of people who had come to witness the end of an era. They were silent now, a sea of faces frozen in a mixture of awe, terror, and morbid curiosity. Louis took a step toward the edge of the platform. He signaled to the drummers to stop, and for a miraculous, terrifying second they obeyed. The silence that followed was more deafening than the drums had been. It was a vacuum in history, a moment where the past and the future collided. "People of France," Louis cried out, his voice ringing across the square with a clarity that shocked even his executioners. "I die innocent of all the crimes laid to my charge. I pardon those who have occasioned my death, and I pray to God that the blood you are now going to shed may never be visited on France." He began to say more, perhaps to plead for his son, perhaps to offer a final blessing. But the officials on horseback were terrified of the effect his words might have on the crowd. General Santerre raised his sword and screamed an order. "Drums! Beat the drums!" The roar returned with a vengeance, swallowing the king's voice, erasing his final testament before it could take root in the minds of the people. The guards seized him, pulling him back toward the center of the platform. The turning point had been reached. There was no more room for words, no more room for mercy. The machine was waiting, its heavy lead weight suspended high above, held by a single taut rope. Louis was pushed toward the plank, the bascule, his bound hands making him stumble. He looked into the dark, hollow opening of the lunette, the wooden collar that would hold his head in place. In that final moment, the reality of the mechanical death hit him. Not a sword wielded by a man, but a blade dropped by a system. He was no longer a person. He was a component in a political calculation, and the result was about to be finalized. The world seemed to shrink until it consisted of nothing more than the rough, splintered grain of the wooden plank beneath his chest. Louis Capet, once the most powerful man in Christendom, was now a horizontal figure strapped to a board that smelled of old rain and the metallic ghost of previous deaths. The executioners pushed the plank forward, and his neck was guided into the lunette, the wooden yoke that would hold him still for the final heartbeat of the monarchy. For a second, his eyes were level with the wicker basket, a simple woven container lined with leather that waited to catch what was about to fall. The drums had reached a pitch that felt like a physical assault, a rhythmic roar that blocked out the sky, the city, and the very concept of mercy. He was no longer a king, no longer a father, and no longer a man. He was the final piece of a machine that was about to complete its first full cycle. High above him, the heavy lead weight and the angled steel blade hung in the grey air, suspended by a single rope. Charles-Henri Sanson, the man who had performed this ritual hundreds of times, stood with the rope in his hand. He was the silent servant of the Republic, the ghost in the machine. He looked down at the king's neck, pale and vulnerable against the dark wood. There was no signal, no fanfare, only the sudden, sharp release of tension. The rope sang as it whipped through the pulleys. The heavy blade descended with a sound that witnesses described as a heavy thud, a mechanical clack that sliced through the history of France. In that millisecond, the ancient bond between the people and their sovereign was severed forever. At exactly 10:22 a.m. on January 21, 1793, the head of Louis XVI fell into the basket. For a moment, the square was held in a vacuum of absolute silence. It was as if the entire nation had held its breath, shocked by its own audacity. The drums stopped. The wind died down. Then one of the executioner's assistants reached into the basket. He grabbed the head by its hair, the hair that had been clumsily shorn just minutes before, and held it aloft for the masses to see. The face was pale, the eyes reportedly still open for a few haunting seconds, staring out at the people who had once knelt in his presence. The silence broke like a dam. A roar went up from the crowd, not a cheer of joy, but a primal, terrifying howl of "Vive la République! Vive la nation!" It was the sound of a taboo being shattered. The blood of the king had been spilled on the soil of France, and in that instant the people realized that if the king could die, then no one was safe, and nothing was sacred. What happened next was a scene of macabre frenzy. The soldiers and the citizens rushed toward the scaffold, breaking through the lines of the National Guard. They were not looking for justice. They were looking for relics. Men dipped their handkerchiefs, their pikes, and even their fingers into the blood that seeped through the cracks of the wooden platform. They believed the blood of a king held a dark, residual power, a liquid proof that the old world was truly dead. Some wiped it on their faces, others tasted it. They were baptizing themselves in the gore of the monarchy, sealing their pact with the revolution in a way that could never be undone. The body was quickly loaded into a wicker chest and taken to the cemetery of the Madeleine, where it was thrown into a pit of quicklime. The Republic wanted him gone so completely that not even a bone would remain for his supporters to mourn over. But the death of Louis XVI was not the end of the tragedy. It was the prologue to a nightmare. The execution did not bring the peace the Jacobins had promised. Instead, it acted as a moral ceiling that had been permanently removed. By killing the king, the revolutionaries had proven that the state's survival was worth any price, and that any person, regardless of their status, could be reduced to a neck and a blade. The armoire de fer, the secret chest that had provided the evidence for his death, had opened a door that could not be closed. If the king could be a traitor, then anyone could be a traitor. Neighbors began to watch neighbors. The Committee of Public Safety was formed, and the reign of terror began in earnest. Maximilien Robespierre, the man who had orchestrated the king's fall, now found himself at the helm of a nation that had developed a mechanical hunger for slaughter. The guillotine, which had been a symbol of enlightened, humane execution, became a factory of death. In the months following Louis's execution, The blade never rested. It was moved from the Place de la Révolution to other squares, following the scent of enemies of the people. The very men who had voted for the king's death soon found themselves following his footsteps up the wooden stairs. Danton, the charismatic orator; Camille Desmoulins, the voice of the press. Even the king's cousin Philippe Égalité, who had voted for execution, all met the same steel fate. The revolution was, as Danton famously said, like Saturn, devouring its own children. The death toll climbed with a terrifying industrial precision. What began with the head of a single man grew into a harvest of 40,000 lives across France. Aristocrats, priests, peasants, and poets were all fed into the machine. The streets of Paris often ran with a red slush that the city's drainage system could not handle. The Great Terror of 1794 saw the execution of nearly 3,900 people in Paris in just 6 weeks. The moral barrier that Louis XVII's life had represented was gone, replaced by a cold bureaucratic fanaticism. The king's error, his belief that he could compromise with a whirlwind, was mirrored by the radicals' belief that they could build a utopia on a foundation of decapitations. The cycle finally turned on its masters in July 1794. Robespierre, the architect of the terror, was himself shouted down in the convention, arrested, and taken to the Conciergerie, the same prison that had held the Queen. On the day of his execution, he was led to the same square where Louis had died. His jaw was shattered by a bullet, bound in a bloody rag, and as he was placed beneath the blade, he let out a scream that was silenced by the same clack that had silenced the king. With his death, the terror finally exhausted itself, leaving a nation drained, traumatized, and ready for the rise of a new kind of absolute ruler, Napoleon Bonaparte. The republic that Louis was killed to protect would eventually bow to an emperor, proving the cruel irony of history. In the end, the execution of Louis XVI stands as one of the most significant moments in the human story. It was the moment the world moved from the age of divinely appointed masters to the age of ideological systems. Louis was not a monster. He was a man of average talents, caught in a storm of extraordinary change. His greatest crime was not malice, but a tragic inability to understand that the world he was born into had already vanished. He believed in locks, in constitutions, and in the quiet dignity of the law, while the people around him believed in the transformative power of blood. The Place de la Révolution is now the Place de la Concorde, the place of harmony. The site of the guillotine is now marked by an Egyptian obelisk, a monument to a civilization so old that the bloody struggles of 1793 seem like a brief flicker in time. But if you stand in the center of that square on a cold, foggy January morning, you can almost hear the phantom roll of the drums. You can almost feel the vibration of the heavy blade hitting the wooden block. Louis XVII's head was the first coin paid into a blood-soaked machine, a machine that proved that once a society decides that some lives are worth less than an idea, there is no limit to how much blood will be shed. The 40,000 who followed him were the true legacy of that January morning, a reminder that revolutions are easy to start, but they have a hunger that only stops when there is no one left to kill. The king was dead, the republic was born in fire, and the world would never be the same again. The locks had been broken, and the ghosts of the terror still linger in the shadows of the City of Light, a silent warning that the guillotine never truly disappears. It only waits for the next time the drums begin to beat.